Usually when we look back through history at a major city being destroyed, there's there's a certain tragic predictability to the narrative, right?
Yeah, definitely.
I
There's
mean,
usually a clear cause.
exactly. Like you're reading about an earthquake that leveled the foundations, or maybe a volcanic eruption, or, even just an accidental fire in a bakery that caught the wind and just couldn't be contained by those old 19th century fire brigades.
Right. It's usually a disaster born of nature or just really terrible circumstance.
Yeah, where you can look at it and say, well, the earth just did what the earth does.
It's the kind of tragedy that leaves a huge scar, obviously, but it doesn't necessarily leave you with a villain. Like, you don't have a malicious author to blame for a fault line shifting.
Exactly. But then you turn the pages of the historical accounts to the ashes of Granada, Nicaragua, in November of 1856. And that entire predictable framework is it's completely shattered.
It really is. It's a completely different kind of destruction.
If you picture the scene that the source material paints for us today, we're not looking at the aftermath of a tectonic plate shifting. We are looking at a vibrant, historic Capitol stone houses, colonial churches, these irreplaceable historical archives,
Generations of family homes.
generations of family homes, all methodically set ablaze by a retreating army. And the crazy thing is, they didn't do it for a tactical military advantage. They did it out of pure, unadulterated spite.
Yeah, it is the absolute distillation of a scorched earth policy.
Right.
But what makes it so distinct from typical military retreats is the underlying psychology of the order.
Right.
Because it wasn't just about denying the enemy a fortress. It was driven by an almost unimaginable level of colonial arrogance. It was essentially an attempt to erase the memory of the place entirely.
And the detail that just stops you in your tracks, so the thing that really brings that arrogance into focus, is the sign.
The sign, yeah.
When the smoke was finally clearing and the ruins of this beautiful city were just smoldering, the invaders planted a sign right in the center of the destruction. It didn't say, like, here is Granada, claiming it for themselves.
Right, it wasn't a victory banner.
No, and it didn't say Granada has fallen either. The sign read, and this is chilling Aquí fui Granada, which translates to, here was Granada.
Was. Just putting an entire civilization into the past tense?
Just writing a whole city, a whole population, and its entire history out of existence with a few strokes of paint. Just deciding that because they couldn't have it, it should just cease to be.
And, the man who gave that order, the man who stood in those ashes and orchestrated this terrifying erasure, was an American.
Yeah.
His name was William Walker.
And if you look at the physical descriptions of Walker in the historical accounts we're pulling from today, he is just a fascinating study in contradictions.
Oh, totally. If you are picturing a towering, physically imposing warlord with, like, a booming voice and a chest full of medals, you have the completely wrong guy.
The completely wrong guy. The Force texts describe him as small in stature, weighing maybe 120 pounds.
Barely.
Yeah, barely. He was exceptionally restrained in his manners, rarely raised his voice above this calm, quiet register, and he had this incredibly cold, unblinking gray gaze.
And on paper, his background doesn't scream mercenary warlord either. Right?
Yeah, not at all. He was a trained medical doctor, a practicing lawyer, and a journalist. If you saw him in a parlor in 1850, he wouldn't look like the kind of man who could walk into a room and inspire absolute terror.
Yet he managed to cultivate a level of fear and fanatical loyalty that really defies his physical presence. I mean, his men were terrified of him, and his enemies learned to dread him.
Which sets the stage for exactly what we are going to unpack for you in this deep dive. We're going to look at the cold, hard mechanics of how this diminutive American doctor and journalist marched into a sovereign Central American nation, purportedly with just 58 men, and somehow managed to become the president of Nicaragua.
It's wild.
We're going to explore how he attempted to violently rewrite the region's demographics, reestablish the institution of slavery, and inadvertently forced a deeply fractured region of rival nations to unite into a single coalition just to stop him.
It is a staggering, almost surreal sequence of events. And before we really get into the machinery of how he pulled this off, it's worth taking a second to frame our approach.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Because the source material we're looking at today takes a very specific clinical look at the ideology of the 19th century, specifically concepts like manifest destiny, aggressive expansionism, and the geopolitics of slavery.
Right.
And whether you view that era through a modern lens of blatant imperialism or try to understand it through the era's own distorted lens of American exceptionalism, our goal today is to impartially examine the factual historical record.
Exactly. We aren't here to endorse or litigate modern political viewpoints. We simply want to look at the mechanics of how Walker exploited the very real, very intense political tensions of his era to literally hijack a country.
Because if you're listening to this and wondering how a man simply orders a foreign capital to be burned to the ground, we have to start by getting inside the mindset of his home country at that specific moment in time.
You can't understand the fire in Grenada without understanding the political climate of the United States in the 1840s and 50s. So let's start with his background. William Walker was born in Nashville, Tennessee in 1824.
And by all contemporary accounts, he was considered a child prodigy.
Oh, the timeline of his early life is exhausting just to read.
Tell me about it.
He goes to university as a teenager, graduates at the age of 14, gets a medical degree from the University of Pennsylvania by 19, then travels to study medicine in Europe.
All before his 20s.
Yeah. Then he comes back, apparently gets bored, pivots to studying law in New Orleans, passes the bar, and then works as an editor and journalist. He has all the tools, the education, and the pedigree for a very comfortable, highly respectable upper-class American life.
The problem with respectability, though, is that it implies boundaries. And the sources note that Walker was singularly obsessed with something he defined as greatness.
And in the context of the United States during the mid-19th century, greatness was inextricably linked to a very specific, very aggressive national ideology, wasn't it?
Manifest destiny. You hear that phrase tossed around in high school history classes, and it has this elegant, almost romantic ring to it. But the source material is very clear about the mechanics behind that phrase. It wasn't just a poetic idea about moving west.
No, it was a highly dangerous operational belief system.
Exactly. Manifest destiny functioned as a blanket justification for conquest. It was the mainstream political belief that the United States had historical, and many argued a divine, mission to expand its territory across the entire continent and, perhaps beyond.
Right. The underlying premise was that American political systems, its economic engines, and specifically its Anglo-Saxon culture, were inherently superior and destined to envelop other peoples and nations.
And this wasn't just abstract philosophy debated in parlors. I mean, by 1848, following the Mexican-American War, the U.S. had swallowed up a staggering amount of Mexican territory.
We're talking about the landmass that makes up modern-day California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and parts of several other states.
It was a colossal territorial gain framed to the American public as a grand national triumph. But underneath those celebrations of map drawing, the United States was dealing with a massive internal crisis.
I'm trying to understand the domestic backing for the extreme actions we're about to discuss. If the U.S. government is officially at peace with its southern neighbors after 1848, why are major political and financial players quietly interested in funding private, unauthorized wars? Like, was the South just greedy for more farmland?
It goes much deeper than just wanting more cotton fields, actually. It was an existential political requirement for their survival.
How so?
Well, the Southern slaveholding establishment realized that as the country expanded west, every new territory added to the Union would eventually become a state. And every new state gets 2 senators.
The Senate math.
Exactly. If the new states entered as free states, the anti-slavery North would eventually secure enough power in Congress to outlaw slavery nationwide. To maintain their political balance of power, the South desperately needed new territories, new slave state allies, and new markets.
So they were looking at a map, realizing they were running out of room out west, and started looking south. They realized that places like Mexico and Central America didn't just have to be foreign neighbors. They could be absorbed and transformed into extensions of the American pro-slavery project.
That is the exact geopolitical ecosystem that William Walker steps into. He recognizes that there is an enormous appetite and deep pockets in the South for anyone who can deliver new territory.
But before he set his sights on his ultimate prize in Nicaragua, he needed to prove his concept right. He needed a practice run.
He did. And that practice run is almost comical in its audacity, but it shows you exactly how his mind worked.
Right. So in 1853, he gathers a small group of heavily armed men in San Francisco and sails down to invade the Mexican territories of Baja California and Sonora.
Keep in mind, the U.S. is not at war with Mexico at this point. This is a private citizen deciding to launch a military invasion of a sovereign nation.
Which is wild.
The historical term for this is a filibuster. Today we use that word to describe a politician talking endlessly to delay a vote. But in the 19th century, a filibuster derived from a Dutch word meaning freebooter, or pirate, was a mercenary adventurer who engaged in unauthorized military expeditions into foreign countries to foment revolution or annex territory.
Okay, so Walker, acting as a filibuster, lands in Mexico with a few dozen guys. He doesn't have the backing of the U.S. military. He doesn't have a supply chain. He just shows up, captures a minor coastal town, and what does he do? He immediately issues a decree declaring himself the president of the Republic of Sonora.
A republic that existed entirely on the piece of paper he just signed.
It's a completely fictitious country. He invents a flag, gives himself a presidential title over a vast stretch of land he doesn't control, and starts promising to grant huge tracts of land to any Americans who will come down and join his new country.
And mechanically, this attempt fails miserably. He has no logistics. He assumes the local Mexican population will just passively accept his rule, which they absolutely do not.
Shocking.
Right. The local resistance is fierce. He runs out of food. His men start deserting, and he is eventually forced to march back across the U.S. border, completely defeated, starving, and literally wearing rags.
Now, if you are listening to this and wondering what happens to an American citizen who raises a private army, invades a neighboring country that the U.S. is officially at peace with, and tries to steal a province, you would assume he goes to federal prison for the rest of his life.
That would be the logical assumption.
And he is indeed put on trial in San Francisco for violating the Neutrality Act of 1794.
Because the Neutrality Act explicitly made it illegal for an American citizen to wage war against any country at peace with the United States, it was designed precisely to prevent rogue actors like Walker from dragging the country into international conflicts.
But he doesn't go to prison. He goes to trial, and a jury takes only 8 minutes to acquit him. 8 minutes?
8 minutes.
Okay, let's unpack this if he's acquitted that fast. Despite blatantly violating the text of the law, does that mean the federal judge was in on it? Or was the jury just openly nullifying the law because they liked what he did? It's almost like a modern tech founder failing spectacularly with a startup, facing zero regulatory consequences, and deciding to just pivot and launch the exact same disruptive model in a new, more vulnerable market. Except his market is a sovereign nation.
That's a great analogy. It was blatant jury nullification driven by intense public sentiment. San Francisco in the 1850s was teeming with prospectors, adventurers, and expansionists who firmly believed in manifest destiny.
Right.
They didn't see Walker as a criminal violating international law. They saw him as a bold pioneer attempting to bring, quote-unquote, civilization to what they viewed as an underutilized territory. The jury essentially decided that expanding American influence was more important than the letter of the Neutrality Act.
That acquittal is such a crucial mechanical detail in this story. It wasn't just a lucky break in court. It was a massive, flashing neon sign to Walker and to his financial backers. It told him that the legal system wasn't going to stop him.
Exactly. It proved that there were no consequences for failure, provided his actions loosely aligned with the broader, unspoken national interest of expansion. He realized he didn't need to fear the U.S. government. He just needed better logistics, more funding, and crucially, a more vulnerable target.
He learned that you can't just storm a beach uninvited and expect to hold the territory. You need to weigh in. Which brings us to the perfect storm brewing in Nicaragua. Because Walker didn't just throw a dart at a map of Central America and show up with guns blazing. He actually got his foot in the door because he was legally invited.
Right. And to understand how that happens, we have to examine the internal state of Nicaragua in the mid-1850s. Nicaragua had gained independence from Spain a few decades prior, and like many newly independent republics, it was struggling to build stable, centralized institutions.
But more than that, it was tearing itself apart in a brutal civil war.
Yes. The source material dives deep into this rivalry, and it's not a minor political disagreement. It's a deeply entrenched, bitter conflict between two major cities, León and Granada.
And if we look at the mechanics of this rivalry, it explains everything about why Walker succeeds. You have León, which was the intellectual and political center of Nicaraguan liberalism.
León was historically tied to the middle classes, professionals, and artisans. They favored a more secular state, less power for the Catholic Church, and broader free trade policies.
And on the other side, you have Granada, which was the absolute bastion of conservatism. Granada was where the wealth lived. It was dominated by the old aristocratic families, the large landholders, the merchants who controlled the trade route.
Right. They wanted a highly centralized government, strong ties with the church, and the preservation of the traditional colonial social hierarchy.
This wasn't a modern political debate where one side wins an election and the other side acts as the opposition. When the political mechanisms failed to resolve their differences over who controlled the state, they took up arms.
By 1854, it is a full-blown, incredibly bloody civil war. The conservative government, led by Fruto Chamorro, is based in Granada. The Liberals, based in Leon, form an opposition government led by a man named Francisco Castellón.
And the liberals are losing. The conservatives have better resources, better military organization, and by late 1854, Castellón's liberal forces are getting crushed on the battlefield. They are isolated, running out of men, running out of morale, and they are desperate for any kind of leverage to tip the scales.
Desperation on a national scale creates a very specific kind of vulnerability. It blinds leaders to long-term consequences, and into this vacuum of desperation steps an American named Byron Cole.
Byron Cole is such a fascinating character in this narrative. He's a general, he's a businessman. He's a newspaper owner and land promoter operating in California, and he happens to be a friend of William Walker.
Cole travels down to Nicaragua, gets an audience with the desperate liberal leader Castellón, and makes him a pitch. But he doesn't say, I have a rogue warlord who wants to take over your country. He pitches a very careful legal loophole.
Right, he offers Castellón a colonization contract. The proposal is that Cole will arrange for 300 American colonists to travel to Nicaragua. On paper, these are agricultural settlers coming to farm the land. But the contract includes a clause stating these colonists have the right to bear arms forever.
It's the thinnest possible veil for a mercenary contract. Castellón knows exactly what he's buying. He's buying a private American militia with modern weapons to fight his domestic political rivals. He signs the contract, and Cole brings it back to Walker.
Walker, having learned from his failure in Mexico, knows that having this legal invitation is paramount. It allows him to bypass the U.S. Neutrality Act. He's not invading, he's just emigrating as a colonist at the invitation of a local government faction.
So, in June 1855, Walker sets sail from California and arrives in Nicaragua. And this is the part of the source material where the math just genuinely makes me pause. He arrives with 58 men.
58 men, wait, 58 guys. How does an entire country begin to fall to a force the size of a high school marching band? Was the internal division really that blinding? I mean, how does anyone look at a country with tens of thousands of people, active armies, and fortified cities and think, yeah, my 58 guys can take this?
It seems impossible.
Did they have some sort of massive technological advantage, like early Gatling guns? Or is the historical record just romanticizing a bigger force? The math here isn't adding up for me.
The math is startling, but it makes sense when you break down the military mechanics of the mid-19th century. First, you have to look at the weaponry. The local Nicaraguan militias were largely conscripts, often armed with older, smoothbore muskets.
Which are pretty slow, right?
Exactly. These are weapons that take a long time to reload and are notoriously inaccurate at a distance. Walker's men, many of whom were veterans of the Mexican-American War, were armed with modern repeating firearms, specifically Colt revolvers and modern rifles.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. A single man with a Colt revolver, which can fire 6 shots in rapid succession without reloading, had a catastrophic tactical advantage in close quarters combat over someone armed with a single-shot musket.
Okay, so a massive force multiplier in terms of firepower.
Massive. Secondly, they had an intense psychological advantage. Walker deliberately cultivated this aura of invincibility. He named his tiny band of mercenaries the Immortals, which tells you everything you need to know about their hubris.
Immortals. Good grief.
The text points out that these men were driven by a toxic cocktail of adrenaline, the promise of free land, and a deep-seated white supremacist ideology that convinced them they were naturally superior to the local population.
And crucially, they weren't fighting alone. They were instantly attached to the existing Nicaraguan Liberal Army. They were meant to be the shock troops, the tip of the spear for Castellón's forces.
That was the fatal flaw in Castellón's strategy. He thought he was hiring specialized muscle. He viewed Walker as a manageable, controllable tool that he could use to smash the conservatives in Granada and then send back to his farm.
Right.
He entirely failed to recognize that a man who had already attempted to invent his own republic in Mexico did not travel to Central America to take orders from anyone.
They handed him the keys to the front door, assuming he'd just wait in the foyer, but Walker kicks the door wide open. But it's not an immediate success, right? His very first battle, the First Battle of Rivas in June 1855, is a disaster.
It was a significant tactical defeat. Walker led an assault on the city of Rivas. The local liberal forces he was supposed to coordinate with failed to support him effectively, and he took heavy casualties. A sensible mercenary, having lost a chunk of his 58 men, would have cut his losses, gotten back on a ship, and returned to San Francisco.
But he doesn't retreat back to the U.S. He regroups. He realizes that relying on the command structure of the Nicaraguan liberals is a liability. If he's going to win, he has to become the absolute center of gravity in this conflict. He starts recruiting more Americans who are filtering down the transit routes, and he changes his tactics.
And this leads to the turning point in September 1855 at the Battle of La Virgin. Walker's forces managed to bait the conservative army into attacking them in a fortified position.
And those Colt revolvers come into play.
Exactly. The superior firepower of the American rifles and revolvers decimates the charging conservative forces. It's a decisive victory, and it instantly transforms Walker's status.
He's no longer just a weird foreign auxiliary unit. He is suddenly the most effective military commander on the board. And he capitalizes on this momentum immediately. Just a month later, on October 13, 1855, he does something the liberal armies hadn't been able to do in years of civil war. He captures Grenada.
The mechanics of how he captured it are brilliant in a purely tactical sense. Instead of marching overland and facing the heavy fortifications at the front gates, he hijacks a lake steamer, a steamship operating on Lake Nicaragua.
Wow.
He loads his men onto it, sails across the lake in the middle of the night, and attacks the city from the rear docks, completely bypassing the main defenses.
That's total surprise attack. And the city falls with barely a fight.
Yeah.
And as we established earlier, Grenada wasn't just a military objective. It was the beating heart of the conservative establishment. It's where the elite families lived, where the wealth was stored. By taking Grenada, Walker essentially takes the king on the chessboard.
With the capital in his hands, the entire dynamic of the country shifts. The Civil War grinds to a halt because the conservatives have lost their power center. A provisional government is rapidly formed in an attempt to stabilize the nation.
Right.
They put a moderate Nicaraguan named Patricio Rivas in the role of formal president, trying to project an image of a unified, sovereign government.
And to solidify this, they strike a formal peace pact with the commander of the conservative forces, General Ponciano Corral. Corral agrees to lay down his arms, recognize the new government, and in exchange, he's made the Minister of War. On paper, it looks like a negotiated settlement. The Civil War is over, and Walker is just sitting in the background as the commander of the army, playing the role of kingmaker.
But this is where the narrative shifts from a story of military opportunism into a masterclass in psychological terror, because Walker has zero intention of sharing power or operating within the bounds of a negotiated peace.
Here's where it gets really interesting. He doesn't just want power. He wants to entirely rewrite the society. Shortly after signing this peace treaty, Walker claims his spies have intercepted letters written by General Corral, supposedly reaching out to other Central American nations for help against the Americans. So Walker, acting entirely on his own authority, arrests the very man he just signed a peace treaty with. He convenes a quick court-martial made up entirely of his own American officers, finds Corral guilty of treason, and executes him by firing squad in the main plaza of Grenada.
We really need to pause and look at the underlying machinery of that execution. The source text makes it very clear that shooting General Corral wasn't a standard act of military discipline. It was an act of profound psychological dominance.
Absolutely.
Corral was a titan in Nicaraguan society. He was a respected, high-ranking leader of the conservative faction.
It's a terrifying flex of power. You don't execute the opposing general immediately after signing a treaty with him just because you're worried about a few letters. You do it to break the psychological spine of the nation.
Precisely the intended effect. It was a broadcast to every single citizen in Nicaragua, liberal and conservative alike, that nobody was safe. His message was, the old rules of your society no longer apply. The treaties you sign mean nothing. I hold the monopoly on violence.
And it must have terrified the provisional president.
Oh, it instantly emasculated Patricio Rivas. Rivas realized in that moment that he was nothing more than a puppet, and that Walker's foreign militia held absolute control over the country.
The relationship between Walker and the puppet President Rivas predictably disintegrates. Rivas realizes he's trapped and eventually flees. So Walker decides to just drop the facade entirely. He doesn't want to be the man behind the throne, he wants the throne. So he organizes a national election.
Election being a highly subjective term in this context.
Right. I want to explore how that actually functions. How do you administer an election across an entire foreign country when your core power base is just a few hundred foreign mercenaries holding the capital? It has to be purely theatrical, right?
It was entirely theatrical. You have to picture the logistics of this. Voting stations set up in a country under active, heavy military occupation by a foreign force. The ballots were counted and in many cases likely manufactured by Walker's own officers.
Of course.
Dissent was completely silenced by the threat of violence. The results were entirely predetermined.
And so, on July 12, 1856, the theater concludes. William Walker, the doctor and journalist from Nashville, Tennessee, stands in the Plaza of Granada and is sworn in as the President of the Republic of Nicaragua.
It's hard to even picture.
Just think about the surreal, chilling optics of that moment.
Yeah.
An American citizen taking a presidential oath of a sovereign Central American nation, surrounded not by local citizens cheering him on, but by his own heavily armed, foreign, private army.
It is the ultimate manifestation of a state collapsing under the weight of foreign intervention and internal division. But the text emphasizes that taking the title of president wasn't the end game for Walker.
Right.
The title just gave him the pseudo-legal authority to begin implementing the grand ideological project he had brought with him from the American South.
And this is where the story pivots from an unbelievable military adventure into a genuine ideological horror show. Walker isn't content to just sit in the presidential palace and collect taxes. He begins issuing a series of sweeping decrees designed to fundamentally rewrite the DNA of the country.
Yeah.
First, he decrees that English is now the co-official language of Nicaragua, alongside Spanish. Then, he starts seizing massive estates and plantations owned by his political rivals, mostly conservatives, and begins handing those property deeds over to his American officers and financial backers.
He's dismantling the existing economic hierarchy and replacing it with a newly imported American elite. But it's his third major decree that reveals the true, dark heart of his mission. Walker signs a decree explicitly revoking the abolition of slavery.
This is a point we absolutely must drill into because it's horrifying. Central America, including Nicaragua, had abolished slavery decades earlier, shortly after they gained independence from Spain. Slavery was not the engine of the Nicaraguan economy in the 1850s.
Right.
The local elites weren't clamoring for it to be brought back.
He wasn't responding to local economic pressures at all. He was responding to the geopolitical needs of the American South.
Right.
By legalizing slavery, he was sending a massive institutional signal to the Southern planter class in the United States. He was essentially telling them, the laws are clear, come down here, bring your capital, bring your agricultural expertise, and bring the human beings you enslave. We are building a new frontier for the American pro-slavery project.
So what does this all mean? He was basically trying to gentrify a sovereign nation for American enslavers. It's closer to an aggressive corporate hostile takeover, but instead of liquidating financial assets, he's liquidating human freedom and importing a foreign elite to run the plantation.
Exactly.
But to sustain a massive, society-altering project like that, you need vast amounts of money, and you need a constant, unimpeded logistical pipeline to the United States. And that brings us to the transit route.
You cannot understand Walker's rise or his eventual downfall without understanding the geography of the Nicaraguan transit route. In the 1850s, before the Transcontinental Railroad or the Panama Canal, getting from the east coast of the U.S. to the newly discovered gold fields of California was incredibly difficult.
Right, there were only a couple of options.
You could risk a months-long wagon journey across the continent, or you could sail all the way down around the tip of South America, which was dangerous and took half a year.
But if you looked at a map, there was a shortcut. You could take a steamship from New York down to the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua. Then, you travel up the San Juan River, cross the massive Lake Nicaragua by boat, and from the western end of the lake, it's only about a 12-mile carriage ride across a strip of land to reach the Pacific Ocean.
And from there, you catch another ship up to San Francisco.
Right. It shaved weeks off the journey. During the height of the California gold rush, this specific geographic bottleneck was arguably the most lucrative transit corridor on the planet. Millions of dollars in gold and tens of thousands of passengers were flowing through it every year.
And who controlled this incredibly lucrative bottleneck? It wasn't the Nicaraguan government. It was controlled by an American shipping magnate, a billionaire named Cornelius Vanderbilt, through his company, the Accessory Transit Company.
Vanderbilt had negotiated a sweetheart concession from the Nicaraguan government years earlier that gave him a virtual monopoly on this route. Walker knew that whoever controlled the transit route controlled the real power and wealth in Nicaragua. And this is where Walker commits the fatal strategic blunder of his career.
The source details how Vanderbilt had these two rivals in the shipping business, Charles Morgan and Cornelius Garrison. They are actively trying to steal control of the transit company out from under Vanderbilt.
Right.
They look at Walker sitting in Granada with his army, and they see an opportunity. They approach Walker and offer him a deal. If you use your new presidential power to revoke Vanderbilt's legal concession and hand the transit rights over to us, We will provide you with steady funding, and we'll use our ships to transport new recruits and weapons to your army for free.
And Walker, drunk on his own success and believing his own mythology of invincibility, agrees. He uses a flimsy legal pretext to seize Vanderbilt's company assets in Nicaragua and hands the entire operation over to Morgan and Garrison.
It's an astounding miscalculation.
It really is. That's like a rogue startup aggressively suing the biggest tech monopoly on Earth while they barely have enough cash to keep the lights on. Vanderbilt didn't just fight back. He completely deplatformed Walker.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. Vanderbilt was not a man you crossed. He was one of the wealthiest, most ruthless, and most politically connected men in the Western Hemisphere. He didn't need to send an army to fight Walker. He used his capital and his logistics network as a weapon. Vanderbilt immediately deployed his fleet to blockade the transit route.
He choked the system. He ordered his captains not to transport anyone who looked like they were going to join Walker's army. He pressured the U.S. government to enforce neutrality laws against Morgan and Garrison ships, tying them up in port.
He severed Walker's logistical umbilical cord. Without the ships bringing in fresh American recruits, ammunition, and gold, Walker's forces in Nicaragua began to wither. And this reveals a very grim reality about 19th century capitalism. Vanderbilt didn't intervene because he had a moral objection to Walker reinstating slavery or violating Nicaraguan sovereignty. He didn't care about the people of Central America. He intervened entirely because Walker messed with his monopoly and his bottom line.
The enemy of my enemy is my highly vindictive shipping magnate. Vanderbilt realizes that to truly crush Walker, he needs boots on the ground in Nicaragua, so he starts quietly collaborating with and funneling resources to the neighboring Central American nations who are watching Walker's rise with absolute horror.
Which brings us to the regional response. While Walker believed he could easily dominate Nicaragua because of its internal divisions, his sheer unchecked aggression was setting off massive alarm bells across every border.
Costa Rica was the first to fully diagnose the severity of the threat. If you were sitting in the presidential palace in San Jose, Costa Rica, looking north, you see an American mercenary who just legalized slavery and is talking about building an empire.
Costa Rican President Juan Rafael Mora Porras was incredibly astute. He recognized that Walker's ideology of manifest destiny did not have a stopping point. Walker wasn't going to be satisfied with just Nicaragua.
Right, he'd want more.
If he successfully consolidated a slave empire there, the geographic necessity of controlling the entire transit route would inevitably push him southward into Costa Rica. It was an existential threat to Costa Rican sovereignty and freedom.
So President Mora Porras doesn't wait for Walker to cross the border. He makes a massive preemptive call. He formally declares war on the filibusters. In March of 1856, Costa Rican forces marched north and meet Walker's men at the Battle of Santa Rosa.
And this battle is crucial because the Costa Ricans win decisively. It was a vital psychological victory for the region because it shattered the mythology Walker had built. It proved that these American mercenaries, who viewed themselves as racially and militarily superior, could be routed in the field by Central American forces.
They chase Walker's forces back into Nicaragua, leading to the Second Battle of Rivas in April 1856. And I want to spend a moment here because this battle is the birthplace of a deeply poignant piece of Costa Rican national identity.
Yes, the historical narrative of Juan Santamaria.
The source highlights him as a young, working-class drummer boy from the town of Alajuela. During the battle, a group of Walker's heavily armed men are holed up in a large hostel, firing out from defensive positions, causing massive casualties among the advancing Costa Rican troops.
Right.
They need to burn the building down to flush them out, but anyone who tries to get close with a torch is immediately shot. Santamaria volunteers for what is undeniably a suicide mission. He grabs a torch, advances under heavy concentrated fire, and manages to set the roof of the building ablaze before he is killed. The building burns, the filibusters are forced out, and the Costa Ricans win the day.
It's an incredible story.
Santamaria instantly becomes, and remains to this day, an enduring national symbol of sacrifice and resistance against foreign imperialism.
But the text is very careful to ground this heroism in the grim reality of 19th century warfare. It doesn't let you walk away thinking this was a clean, glorious victory, because right after the Battle of Rivas, the Costa Rican army faces a completely different kind of devastation.
Cholera.
Exactly. Warfare in the 1850s was unsanitary in ways we can barely comprehend today. Dead bodies contaminating the water supply, lack of medical knowledge about bacteria. It was a breeding ground for disease. A cholera outbreak rips through the armies.
I think we need to explain the mechanics of how terrifying this was. Cholera isn't just a bad fever. It causes such severe gastrointestinal distress that a healthy person can literally dehydrate to death in a matter of hours. And the Costa Rican army, realizing they are infected and dying rapidly, has to retreat back home. But in doing so, they drag the disease back into their civilian population.
The logistics of a retreating infected army are a nightmare. As they march back through villages and towns on their way to the capital, they are contaminating water sources along the route. The epidemic spreads into the civilian population of Costa Rica, ultimately killing around 10% of the entire country's population. It is a catastrophic death toll.
It forces you to reevaluate the true cost of Walker's ambition. This wasn't just a political struggle between armed men. It was a nightmare of disease, decimated communities, and immense collateral devastation brought down upon innocent people who had absolutely nothing to do with the initial conflict.
But despite this horrific tragedy, the sheer scale of the threat Walker posed finally overrides the historical fractures of the region. The leaders of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras look at the carnage in Nicaragua, look at the cholera in Costa Rica, and realize that if they don't intervene collectively, they will all be picked off one by one.
He poked the bear, and instead of one bear, he got 5 different nations putting aside their grudges. It's the ultimate enemy of my enemy is my friend scenario, forged in fire. This is a monumental geopolitical shift. Central America had been politically fragmented, deeply suspicious of one another, and locked in border disputes since the dissolution of the Federal Republic of Central America in the late 1830s. They did not function as a unified bloc.
Until William Walker. It is the profound, overriding historical irony of his entire campaign. He invaded Nicaragua believing that local divisions would make his conquest easy, but his extreme violence, his overt racism, and his radical pro-slavery agenda became the very catalyst that forced Central America to unify.
Right.
The man who sought to conquer the region accidentally forged its modern regional consciousness. They formed the Allied Army of Central America. They didn't unite out of a sudden, newfound political harmony. They united out of sheer, desperate necessity to stop a foreign slave empire from taking root in their soil.
And this unified coalition, backed by the financial and logistical stranglehold of Cornelius Vanderbilt's blockade, begins to close in on Walker like a vice. They squeeze his territory, cutting off his movements. This leads to a legendary engagement in September 1856, the Battle of San Jacinto.
San Jacinto is a deeply significant moment in Nicaraguan history. A relatively small Nicaraguan force, commanded by Colonel José Dolores Estrada, is fortified in a hacienda. They are attacked by a larger, better-armed group of filibusters. And in a remarkable twist of narrative fate, the American forces in this battle are being led by Byron Cole.
Byron Cole, the American businessman who originally pitched the colonization contract to the Liberals in the first place.
The very same.
The man who opened the door for Walker. Talk about the story coming full circle.
The battle is incredibly fierce. The Nicaraguans run out of ammunition and resort to throwing stones to repel the Americans. But they manage to hold the line, and they ultimately win the battle. Byron Cole is killed in the retreat. But the source material points out a vital, often overlooked detail about how that battle was won. The victory was heavily aided by the flecheros, the Matagalpa.
This is crucial. The flecheros were a group of indigenous archers from the Matagalpa region who had joined the fight alongside the Nicaraguan forces. They played a decisive tactical role in repelling the well-armed Americans.
But the text forces us to confront how historical memory is constructed. For over a century, the indispensable contribution of these indigenous archers was marginalized or entirely erased from the official state histories of the battle.
Wow, just written out.
Yeah, the government textbooks preferred to focus on the uniformed generals of European descent, whitewashing the fact that indigenous fighters were essential to defeating a white supremacist invasion.
It's a sobering reminder that history isn't just a record of what happened. It's a heavily curated narrative controlled by those who hold power afterward. But back on the ground in late 1856, the walls are rapidly closing in on Walker. The Central American coalition is advancing on multiple fronts. Vanderbilt's blockade is starving his army of men and munitions. Walker realizes his position is completely untenable. He knows he has to abandon his prized jewel, the capital city of Granada.
Which brings us back to the visceral, horrifying image we started this deep dive with. Walker orders his men to evacuate, but he refuses to leave a functioning city for the Allied forces to occupy.
In November 1856, he gives the order to systematically destroy Granada. It takes his men over 2 weeks of grueling labor to burn the stone and adobe structures, blow up the churches with gunpowder, and torch the archives.
Just unbelievable destruction.
It wasn't a strategic military decision to slow the enemy. It was a temper tantrum on an imperial scale. It was the physical manifestation of his worldview, the idea that he possessed the sovereign right to decide if a foreign civilization was allowed to exist. And he leaves that sign in the ashes. Aquí fu Granada.
But burning the city didn't save him. It just hardened the resolve of the coalition. He retreats to the city of Rivas, where he is eventually besieged by the Allied forces. By May 1st, 1857, his men are starving, diseased, and completely out of options. William Walker is finally forced to surrender.
But listen to this mechanical detail of the surrender because it is incredibly revealing about the global power dynamics of the era. He is surrounded and defeated by Central American armies, but he doesn't surrender his sword to a Costa Rican or Nicaraguan general.
No, he negotiates a surrender to Commander Charles Davis, an officer of the United States Navy who happened to have a warship anchored off the coast.
And the U.S. Navy just accepts his surrender and evacuates him. They load Walker and his surviving mercenaries onto American ships and sail them back to the United States.
It's wild.
He completely bypasses any local justice system. He doesn't face a tribunal in Nicaragua for burning their capital. He's tried in Costa Rica for instigating a war that killed 1/10 of their population. The U.S. military just scoops him up and takes him home.
It perfectly underscores how the apparatus of the U.S. state effectively shielded a man who had committed massive atrocities because his underlying objective, expanding American influence in Central America was still viewed sympathetically by huge factions of the government.
Right.
The U.S. Navy was not going to allow a Central American court to execute an American citizen, regardless of what crimes he had committed on their soil.
And the reaction when he returns to the U.S. proves that point entirely. When he arrives in New Orleans, he isn't arrested. He isn't thrown in chains for violating the Neutrality Act again. He is greeted by massive crowds as a conquering hero. Politicians throw banquets for him. Newspapers praise his bravery, which really demands a hard look if he was welcomed as a hero back home. Doesn't that mean calling him a rogue adventurer is kind of a historical cop-out? He was clearly acting out the dark, unspoken desires of a massive chunk of the American political establishment.
That is precisely the analytical point the source material drives home. Calling him a rogue adventurer individualizes the blame and ignores the systemic support he received. Walker was an extreme, violent expression of ideas, white supremacy, unregulated expansionism, and the desperate need to expand slavery that had deep institutional backing in the United States.
He wasn't acting alone.
No, he had financiers in New York, politicians in the South looking the other way, and thousands of young men eager to join his ranks. He was a symptom of a highly aggressive national ideology.
But for all his grandiosity, Walker's ego simply couldn't accept that it was over. He spends the next few years touring the U.S., writing a book, defending his actions, and constantly trying to organize new expeditions to retake Nicaragua. He launches a few abortive attempts that get intercepted, but finally, in August 1860, he manages to land on the coast of Honduras with a small group of men, hoping to use it as a staging ground to march south.
But the geopolitical ecosystem had fundamentally shifted. It's 1860, the United States is on the absolute precipice of its own catastrophic civil war. The political appetite and funding for filibustering in Central America had evaporated. More importantly, his infamy preceded him. He had no element of surprise, and the local populations were acutely aware of the danger he posed.
He captures an old fort in Trujillo, Honduras, but he is quickly cornered by a combined force of Honduran troops and the British Royal Navy, who also had economic interests in the region and wanted him gone. He surrenders to the British, likely hoping for another geopolitical bailout, assuming they would hand him over to the Americans.
But the British commander refuses to play along this time. He simply turns Walker over to the Honduran authorities.
And there is no U.S. Navy ship coming to bail him out this time. The Honduran president, José Santos Guardiola, understands exactly who they have in custody, and he doesn't hesitate for a moment. He signs the death warrant. On September 12, 1860, William Walker is marched out to the ruins of an old Spanish fort in Trujillo, and he is executed by a firing squad. He was only 36 years old.
It is a violent end to a short life that left an astonishing generation-defining amount of destruction in its wake.
Which brings us to the core synthesis of our deep dive today. When you step back and look at the entirety of this source material, the primary takeaway is that William Walker wasn't just some quirky footnote of 19th century history. He was a violent agent of colonialism whose actions permanently altered the political DNA of Central America.
His legacy is irrevocably etched into their national identities. Costa Rica defines a significant part of its modern patriotism through the memory of the Battle of Santa Rosa and the sacrifice of Juan Santamaria.
And Nicaragua.
Nicaragua's national memory is anchored by the resilience shown at San Jacinto, the belated recognition of the Matagalpa archers, and the survival and rebuilding of Grenada. The trauma of his invasion taught these nations a permanent lesson: that independence isn't a fixed state you achieve once it is a fragile condition that must be constantly, sometimes violently, defended against foreign opportunism.
And the ultimate mechanical lesson from this entire saga is a deeply chilling observation about internal division. Sovereignty is at its absolute most vulnerable when a society is broken from within. The Nicaraguan liberal faction allowed their bitter domestic hatred for the conservatives to entirely blind them to the broader geopolitical reality.
Absolutely.
They thought they could invite a foreign mercenary in to settle a local score, completely failing to realize that when you open the door to a conqueror, he doesn't just attack your enemies, he takes the whole house.
It is a stark warning about institutional fragility. Whenever internal political elites decide to prioritize their own domestic rivalries and power struggles over the sovereignty of the nation as a whole, they create a power vacuum. And history shows us, time and time again, that larger, more aggressive foreign powers are always waiting, ready, and all too happy to fill that vacuum, usually with disastrous consequences for the people who actually live there.
We spent this time exploring how a deeply divided nation practically handed William Walker the keys to their country, only to watch their cities burn and find signs reading, "Here was Grenada," left in the ashes. But it leaves you with something very heavy to ponder on your own. When you look at the landscape of modern geopolitical conflicts around the world today, where proxy groups are funded, armed, and manipulated by massive foreign superpowers to fight domestic civil wars, how often is the William Walker playbook still being used right now? Just executed with modern technology, better funding, and much more sophisticated PR.
The mechanics of exploiting division rarely change, even if the weapons do.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the history of William Walker, and for participating in this journey through the source material with us. See you next time.